Hi, I'm Andrew McCrae. Welcome to our farm and ranch in northwest Missouri. My great-great-grandfather settled here in 1910, and I'm the fifth generation to grow crops and livestock here. As a farmer myself, I know the highs and lows of this life, the issues we confront every day, some new, some as old as farming itself. This show is a place to talk with farmers and others in the ag industry about topics that mean something to us, topics that can improve the present and future of our operations. This is Farming the Countryside. Bill Thomas joins me. He is from Atlanta, Illinois, and Bill and I got to visit. Well, we visited a couple of times. We figured out. I've been to Atlanta, Illinois
Right.
times, and we have interviewed, and we're going to talk about that American Countryside, our daily broadcast. Bill will be appearing on that, but I wanted to take time here in our longer format program to talk about some things going on in Atlanta because as Bill will tell you, a small town, and many of us listening to this, viewing this, are from smaller places in rural and agricultural America. And I think we want to have places where we want to live and work, and hopefully our families and our kids want to too. So, Bill, thanks first of all for joining me. And maybe you should just begin by talking about Atlanta, where that is located, and how big of a town it is. A little smaller than the big Atlanta down in Georgia.
Yes. Well, first off, thanks for inviting me, Andrew. It's a real pleasure. Atlanta, Illinois, by the way, which is named after that one down in Georgia, the bigger one historically. We're a town of 1,649 people per the last census. We are right in the middle of the state of Illinois, about 3 hours south of Chicago and about 3 hours, give or take, north of St. Louis, in the middle of the corn and beans, and uh, agricultural area of this part of the state. As a matter of fact, Atlanta, Andrew, Atlanta is so small. On most streets, you can stand in the middle of the road and look all the way down at the end of the street and see the edge of town, see a cornfield or a bean field out there.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I've been there. It's a nice little town and
Uh-huh.
similar to size, where I'm from. Take me back. We're going to talk about what's going on in Atlanta and has been for a while. Was there a point, though, where the town was ever, in a sense, struggling or finding challenges? Because you've been there and working on things along with others. Was there any one point where you said, hey, we've got to do something or things are going to vanish and fade away?
Yes, definitely. And it's really interesting. Forgive me if I talk a little bit about Route 66, but we need to note that Route 66, the original alignment, runs right through the middle of town. And very interestingly, the success of our local economy has been tied to that road and highways in general, because when it first went through in 1924, oh my goodness, it brought a lot of commerce and traffic to the town that supported our local economy. But then, like so many other communities after World War II, beginning of the Eisenhower administration with the development of the interstate highway system, we got bypassed by Interstate 55. And that was a real blow to this community. I think I remembered sharing with you when you were here, back in the heyday, the 30s and 40s of 66, in our tiny town of 1,600 people, we had 6 or 7 gas stations on Route 66. That's just how busy it was. And then the interstate came through and really dramatically impacted us. So, like many towns, we were literally drying up. We just simply did no longer had the foot traffic in town to support what was once a very vibrant and stable local economy.
So, was there a step one then? You had the historic Route 66, but when the interstate came through, then you may have thought that was dead. Was it the revival of Route 66 that helped, or what were the first steps you took to begin to help bring the town back?
A number of steps were taken over time. And unfortunately, some of the initial ones, in my opinion, from my perspective, weren't successful simply because they weren't recognizing the full extent to which we were developing slowly but surely into a bedroom community. People were leaving us in the morning and not coming back until late at night. And as a result, they were doing the majority of their shopping where in whatever larger city they worked at before they ever returned. So for us to support a retail economy in downtown Atlanta just became increasingly difficult after the interstate went through.
So, what did you begin to decide to do? What did the community focus on? Of okay, if they aren't necessarily going to do a lot of retail shopping here, we still have something to offer.
Right. And in our case, and I know not everybody has this, but I think some principles that I'll reference regarding economic development apply across the board. So others might benefit. But in our case, we literally, I remember the planning commission meeting that I was sitting at the day we were trying to brainstorm what are we going to do? And we were actually sitting in a meeting room that overlooked Route 66 downtown and looked out the window and we said, well, you know what? This road is benefiting from a resurgence of interest. This was back in the late 70s, early 80s. Maybe we can leverage the interest that is being shown in Route 66. And that was, well, first off, everybody around the table laughed when we said, oh, we're going to develop a tourism industry. And I did too, because who would have thought it was possible? But over the last 20 years or so, it really has dramatically impacted our little community.
We're going to, of course, talk about Atlanta specifically, but correct me if I'm wrong. In my travels, I go to little towns all the time to do interviews, and I'm not surprised that people around the table laughed. Do you think, in general, that many times the places we live, we're overlooking some things that people would want to come and see just because we've been around them all our lives and don't think about it?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm a firm believer in adhering to the purity of a brainstorming process where every single idea has potential to be legitimate and worthwhile. And too often, I grew up in a small town. I know exactly what this rural culture is like. And if some idea that it might seem really foreign or unusual to us is brought up, our first reaction is usually not to embrace it. But that's something that is key, in my opinion, to developing a community's capacity to do economic development. And that is don't don't put any idea off the table. Let it come up and let's see where it might go.
So people laughed, but what began to happen then? Was there a step one to begin to harness what could be
Yeah.
the tourism of Route 66?
Yes, and actually, it wasn't Route 66 to begin with. It was wonderfully a nice coincidence for this program. It was an agricultural attraction because in town we have this glorious circa 1904 wooden grain elevator that was built in 1904. Yeah. And we saved, long story short, it was saved, it was fully restored, placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Uh, and it actually started to bring people to town. So we had a little taste of, oh, people will actually get off the interstate and come look at this. Uh, and they did. But then we quickly looked at 66 and saw a lot of potential there for us. And we embraced that. And that's what we've started with. And that's what we've continued to leverage to this day.
But we should mention, correct me if I'm wrong, on that grain elevator, that was going to be torn down, but it was a local farmer that basically stepped in and said, "No, this
Oh,
is
sure.
this
I love the story. The farm, the grain elevator itself stopped operating in, say, the mid 70s. It was abandoned. That elevator was going to be turned over to the city's fire department and burned down as a training exercise. And thank goodness, one local farmer who, to my knowledge, had never done any kind of historic restoration or become involved in a project like that, stepped forward and said, no, this cannot happen. This is part of our heritage, our agricultural history. It has to be saved. A not for profit was formed, small group created, and they worked. I was on that board for 10 years, very hard to save that elevator. And it's been worth it in the long term.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that because some people listen to this say, "Oh, well, they have Route 66, so we don't have that." But a lot of people would have something similar to an old grain elevator, and you did it. That was step one.
Right. And that's one of the first principles that I believe in and that I think are applicable outside of Atlanta and a place that's fortunate enough like us to have Route 66. We had that grain elevator, another attraction, if you will, because we've learned to teach ourselves to think in terms of what is going to attract people to our town? What assets do we already have that we most likely take for granted but would be unusual or different or interesting to outsiders? How can we develop that? How can we market it and therefore attract people? So we had the grain elevator. We also had an abandoned coal mine, Andrew. Way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the town tried to multiple times to uh, drop a shaft and mine coal because they desperately needed it. Failed every single time. The shaft kept filling up with water. Eventually, they ended up using it for the town's water supply for 20 years. But long story short, that mine shaft was still there. And 2 or 3 years ago, we cleaned out the building that it's in, did a nice job designing an interpretive exhibit to tell its story. And now it's open 7 days a week. People stop and they can actually look down into the shaft and see all the way down to the bottom and read this really intriguing story. And they stop to do it.
Yeah, no, it is neat. I've been out there to see it. The first time that we visited, I believe, is because of an attraction very much tied to Route 66. It was the old cafe that you brought back. Was that one of the first Route 66 then stops you created?
The very first was I know you've seen and others may have heard of. We have a 20-foot tall fiberglass statue of what is colloquially known as a muffler man. They were roadside advertising gimmicks from the 1960s. And he ended up as an attraction in our town because we didn't think of this. Someone else advising us said another principle is find something that nobody else has. Even if you don't have it, create it in your town and differentiate yourself from everyone else. So we were given this opportunity to have loaned to us on a long term loan a 20-foot tall statue of a guy holding a hot dog. Okay. Well, that is rather unusual, but we put him right downtown in a lot that had been abandoned. There were no buildings there on Route 66. And he was the first and biggest, no pun intended, tourism attraction that we started out with. Okay. The cafe came later because we saw how many people were stopping and coming in town. And Andrew, I get excited about things, but I am not over exaggerating. That Bunyan giant 20-foot tall statue of a guy holding a hot dog is known globally. Okay. Not just here in the States, but across the globe. So we started thinking, well, it's great if people stop in our community, but what do you want? You don't want them just to stop and take a picture and then get back in the car and leave. You want them to spend money. So our frame of reference then became, okay, we have a couple of unique attractions, the Hawes Elevator, the coal mine, the Bunyan Giant. What opportunities can we give people to leave some of their money here? And the cafe was one of the ideas we came up with.
And that was a vintage cafe similar to what would have been on Route 66 in its heyday, correct?
Oh, yes, it was a vintage cafe. It opened in 1936, right on Route 66. It was in operation through the mid 1960s. And another sort of principle that we've learned is effective. If you can give people intriguing experiences that touch as many of their senses as possible, that's typically more attractive to the traveling public. So we set out, okay, we're not just going to gut this cafe and have a place for people to stop and eat. No, we want to recreate the experience of walking into a 1936 cafe on Route 66. So that's what we did.
We'll talk about why I was there for my most recent trip in just a moment. But I do want to stop because people are probably saying, okay, all of this is nice, but how do you come up with the cash to make it happen? The cash and the labor and the resources. You have done some things there in Atlanta to help make that happen that other towns perhaps could replicate.
Yeah. And that's a big part of, I'm economic development director for the county that we live in. And I have learned in doing this job, you don't just do the standard economic development things of sustaining existing businesses and growing them and looking for new businesses. For me, one of the most important aspects of my job is to help a community learn how to increase its capacity to do its own economic development without me. It's that old, let's teach a man to fish. Let's not just give him fish. And one of those key elements is helping people recognize the power of private public partnerships. And by that, I mean, because this is one thing we've learned to use effectively here in Atlanta, almost all of the projects that we've done have been a combination of going to our city and our city council. And this is not always easy, helping them see a vision for something. And of course, if we're showing them a vision, what we're really doing is asking them for money to help support that vision. And then we've learned how to go out and find appropriate grant opportunities, become good at writing grants, and a very key third aspect, let the members of your community be give them the opportunity to help, because everybody in my experience wants to help with something. I can give you one small example of that. When we were refurbishing and restoring the Palms Grill Cafe, who did we turn to on the public side primarily? We got a hold of the alumni list of the graduates from Atlanta High School who had all gone there as teenagers, as high schoolers. They picked up their prom corsages there every spring. Some of them worked there. And we said, look, we want to bring this back for the betterment of the community. Can you help do it? And that was about a $500,000 project in total. The Atlanta alumni contributed about 146,000 of that. So it works. I truly believe it works because I've experienced it.
You also have a taxing district, is that right? That helps with some of this too?
Yes. Yes, we have actually two taxing districts, which are fundamental economic development tools. I won't get into all of the details, but one is called a tax increment financing district, or in shorthand, TIF. That is a program that operates whereby if you designate a certain area of your city as a place that could be developed because it needs it, and what you can do then is set aside any increase in assessed value from one year to the next, from the base year that you start with. That increased assessed value, the taxes brought in, goes into a special fund that can only be used for economic development purposes. So it's a self-replenishing mechanism that then keeps fueling more and more and more economic development, which raises the assessment, which gives more money to the fund. It's just a great program. The other one is called a business improvement district or business development district. This is one of our favorites here in Atlanta because you can also define a geographic area in your community and pass an ordinance through the city that says, okay, within this area, and it's typically your downtown business district or wherever your businesses are, we're going to increase sales tax there by anywhere from 0.25% up to a full percentage point. And that increase, whatever it is, that gets put in a dedicated fund, and it too can only be used for economic development purposes. Well, here in Atlanta, we were blessed by not only having some businesses downtown that we could do that through, but we extended it out to our interstate area where we just had a new truck stop built, a Casey's convenience store, and a Dollar General. So we included those in the business development district, and that has really been generating funds, 90,000 plus a year, that can then be turned around to support economic development in this small town.
I'm curious, were people mostly in favor of that? Because anytime we begin to talk about taxes, that can concern people. But in some cases, these taxes would have been paid by people passing through, but certainly the local community would be spending money in these places too.
Yes. And trust me, I've had those conversations with people, and it's a very legitimate question to ask. And the conversation always seemed to get down to the point where you're right. I don't want to spend more on sales tax. But if we're honest with ourselves here in this community, we would ask each other, well, where do you do the majority of your shopping? And it's outside of town. It is not here. And if we can create and use this device of a business development district, and in the process, capture the profits from the thousands and thousands of cars that are traveling Interstate 55 and happen to stop at our Casey's or Dollar General and truck stop, that is a river of gold, if you will, that goes by our town. Those people are paying to develop our community.
So let's get to the most recent addition in Atlanta, because you had a giant man with a hot dog, but now you've got a lot more giant men. Tell them about it.
Oh, yeah. And this has just been probably the most enjoyable project I've worked on in my professional career. We are now the home of something called the American Giants Museum, Andrew. And it is a small museum right on Route 66 downtown that is dedicated to telling the story of this company out in California that originally constructed all of these giant roadside fiberglass advertising figures. Long story short, I met a guy who's also passionate about American Giants about 12 years ago, and he's sort of on a personal mission to find all the remaining ones. He has information and photographs, etc., from International Fiberglass. And over the years, we've talked, and he said, "Boy, I've got all these things, but I don't have a museum." So I said, "Okay, one day, Joel, we'll figure out a way to do a museum." And one day was happened at our grand opening this past May. Yeah, we opened her up.
And so describe this. You've already got a couple of giants, but you'll have more. And it's a nice little museum and part of that tax increment financing and so forth that helped do that.
Yes, yes, we benefited from public-private partnership with the city and the state of Illinois, and the Business Development District helped provide funds. Our local civic organization, the Atlanta Betterment Fund, did fundraising, and we wrote and received a grant through the city that applied to the state on our behalf and received a grant with them. But the museum itself, right now, has two giants on the grounds. The Bunyan giant holding the hot dog is across the street. And then, because of the success of it, a local restaurateur out by the interstate decided he wanted one. So we have four in town right now, but we have room for four more on the grounds of the museum. Our goal, Andrew, by the time we're done, and by done in this case, I mean the Route 66 Centennial in 2026, we'll have 8 in town, making us, here's what we're going to market, we'll be the single largest concentration of American Giants anywhere on 66 from Chicago to LA.
Right.
And it's already working, Andrew, in terms of attracting people.
Bill, in the time we have left, because I do these types of stories and different people will say, okay, well, that's nice, but you really didn't help our schools. You didn't really bring any business to town and so forth. I'm betting you're going to tell me because you did this, some of those other things are happening. Do we just not think of economic development the right way? Because many people say, okay, well, forget about the tourism stuff. We just got to build more businesses and more better schools. But how do you look at it?
Well, as a result, primarily of tourism, we have had new businesses start in town. This past year, 3 or 4 alone. And it's because of the tourists that are coming to town and the fact that we needed places for them to spend money. Other local folks who saw economic opportunity, they said, okay, I'm going to cash in on this and I'm going to locate my business here because of this. And I can give you a number. Since we opened the Giants Museum in May, we have had over 7,000 visitors. And Andrew, those are only the ones who signed the guest book in the museum. So I know there are many more because I see them out on the street and they don't always come in the museum. So you cannot deny that if you're managing to bring 7,000 people to town, they're going to also be spending money here. And it's reflected in the new businesses that have started up.
And in a sense, while it has taken hard work and persistence, any small town could do some of these things, correct?
Yes, because the principle is, we are blessed with Route 66, but any small town, if we didn't have Route 66, we would still have the Hawes Elevator and the coal mine. And we even marketed for a while. We have a wonderful 30-foot tall clock tower on the lawn of the library. I don't know if you remember seeing that. But we used to market and give people an opportunity to go inside the tower because there's actually a circa 1908 hand-wound Seth Thomas clock there. And we'd let them wind the clock and then give them a certificate that says you're an official keeper of the clock from Atlanta. So that may sound like a weird idea, but all we did was look around and try to find things in town that we could turn into something that might be of interest to a visitor. That's the principle. And any town can do that.
Bill, I really appreciate the time. And if people listening to this are interested, I'm sure that they can get a hold of you or just come by Atlanta. You're probably walking around the Giants at some point out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to talk with anybody that wants to further the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for what you're doing in Atlanta. Hopefully other people will come there and see what I got to experience as well.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.